All right. Can you see the clip?
Huh?
Yes, I can.
Perfect.
The story of writing, astronomy, and law. The story of civilization itself begins in one place. Not Egypt, not Greece, not Rome, but Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is an exceedingly fertile plain situated between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. For 5 millennia, this small strip of land situated in what is today Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria fostered innovations that would change the world forever. Inhabited for nearly 12,000 years, Mesopotamia's stable climate, rich soil, and steady supply of fresh water made it ideal for agriculture to develop and thrive. About 6,000 years ago, seemingly overnight, some of these agricultural settlements blossomed into some of the world's first cities. In the period between 4000 and 3100 BC, Mesopotamia was dotted with a constellation of competing city-states. At one point, they were unified under the Akkadian Empire and then broke apart, forming the empires of Assyria and Babylon. Despite near constant warfare, innovation and development thrived in ancient Mesopotamia. They built on a monumental scale, from palaces to ziggurats. Mammoth temples served as ritual locations to commune with the gods. They also developed advanced mathematics, including a base 60 system that created a 60-second minute, a 60-minute hour, and a 360-degree circular angle. The Babylonians used their sophisticated system of mathematics to map and study the sky. They divided one Earth year into 12 periods. Each was named after the most prominent constellations in the heavens, a tradition later adopted by the Greeks to create the zodiac. They also divided the week into 7 days, naming each after their 7 gods embodied by the 7 observable planets in the sky. But perhaps the most impactful innovation to come out of Mesopotamia is literacy. What began as simple pictures scrawled onto wet clay to keep track of goods and wealth developed into a sophisticated writing system by the year 3200 BC. This writing system would come to be called cuneiform in modern times and proved so flexible that, over the span of 3,000 years, it would be adapted for over a dozen different major languages and countless uses, including recording the law of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, which formed the basis of a standardized justice system. But Mesopotamia's success became its undoing. Babylon, in particular, proved too rich a state to resist outside envy. In 539 BC, the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon and sealed his control over the entirety of Mesopotamia. For centuries, this area became a territory of foreign empires. Eventually, Mesopotamia would fade, like its kings, into the mist of history, and its cities would sink beneath the sands of Iraq. But its ideas would prevail in literacy, law, math, astronomy, and the gift of civilization itself.
Mhm.
So that was from the National Geographic on ancient Mesopotamia, and kind of an overview of that and what's going on in that region at this time.
Mhm.
And anything else that you remember that you guys want to share from other classes?
Well, it's unfortunate because it was such a rich area in which to grow. The water, the fertile fields, the prosperity that would be enjoyed by so many and become something that others would envy, and therefore, oh, we've got to take that because, it's just great. It seems like the better the area, the more unrest it would see time after time after time. So maybe it's better to just be a desert dweller and not worry about it.
Yeah, so there's pockets within this area that just it's really fertile. And it's also, there's some areas, as we talked about, sometimes there were places where there were floods and things too. And that was a normal occurrence that would happen in these areas. We especially brought it up when we were talking about like through the promised land and walking in the desert, but then also like walking through the water and the parting of the seas and things like that. That there were places where there was flooding that would occur. I suppose kind of like being in North Dakota when we haven't had rain for a while, then suddenly you have a lot of water, and there can be massive flooding with that.
Yeah, but to my knowledge, nobody has looked at us and said, "Oh, they've got it too good. We better take over."
I suppose I don't know. I mean, if we look at the history of North Dakota before this, the native peoples were caring for this land with prairies, and buffalo hunting was really big, and there's around, we're in the riverbed area, which would have been a forested area, and we as like people, pilgrims and colonizers and others did see North Dakota as a rich land to come in and take fertile farmland, especially in the Northeast, woods out of where we are now, the prairies that we've turned into ranches. And so even North Dakota with that has a lot of rich resources and that we have taken from others too.
What we didn't take from others is how to care properly for the land.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate.
That's something we certainly need to learn how to do. It's for the good of us, and it's part of our covenant with God too, to be caretakers of the land in the same way that God would be caretakers. So this is the land we're on then. Right in the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia. We've got Egypt, there's Babylon, and Assyria before Babylon. And that, right as Assyria has been replaced by Babylon as a major power, that's kind of where we are when we walk into Jeremiah, towards the end of the 7th and the start of the 6th century BCE. And how we date the beginning of Jeremiah is really important. For some people, if you saw in Jeremiah, I don't know if anybody get a chance to read any of Jeremiah.
I didn't. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I wasn't expecting people to have read it actually before today, so I wanted to ask.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Okay, perfect.
Well, thank you, Darlene. At least I'm not alone.
So in a lot of the books of the prophets, and actually in a lot of the books in the Bible, that first chapter, especially the first couple verses in the chapter, try to date us for where they're trying to place us in history. And they're not usually trying to date us as a historical context, but to try to tell us, okay, this is what you should know about the world when you start reading this. Because really, what are dates? When we study history, the important parts of history aren't just the dates on the timeline. The important parts of history are what happened in civilization at that time. And so that's what the authors are trying to do with this, is to tell us who Jeremiah is, and in saying he's a son of one of the priests, what town he was in, the land of Benjamin, which tells us that's one of the tribes. And to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of King Josiah of Judah. And that's what's dating us. This telling us in the days of King Josiah.
Mm-hmm.
So that puts us, do you remember this chart from way back?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And some of you may remember it, some of you may not have seen it.
Yeah.
But so King Josiah, we've got up here,
Looking.
there's Saul, here's David, and Josiah is all the way down here.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Okay.
And so we are pretty far along. In fact, we're near the end of Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be falling soon. King Josiah is the last king that's not considered to be a puppet king. There's two more after Josiah, and both of them were puppet kings. One of them placed in power by the Egyptians, and the other one by the Babylonians. And so this is really like the last push for Judah right at the start of Jeremiah's ministry. Now, the question is that is before us, and scholars don't agree, is did Jeremiah's ministry begin in the time of King Josiah, which this tells us it's around the 13th year around Josiah that they're trying to date us. And that's in verse 2, in the 13th year of his reign. So is that when Jeremiah started talking to people as a prophet, or was that when Jeremiah was born? Because if we look under chapter 1, I'm sorry, verse 4, it begins with this. Now the word of the Lord came to me, Jeremiah, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So, did Jeremiah's ministry begin before he was born or at his birth? Or did it begin when he started publicly speaking to people? And that's debated by scholars. Many scholars kind of lean more towards that this is marking the date of his birth, for some other reasons that we're going to get into in a moment. But that kind of divide determines how you read Jeremiah, of where is it within. Was Jeremiah active public ministry for 4 decades, or was this from the time of his birth that we're starting? So, and then Jeremiah, scholars believe he died sometime after 586 BCE. So he died after that period. So we've got Babylon has replaced Assyria as the major power in the ancient Near East, which means that Jeremiah's ministry, however we date it, lived before and after the fall of Jerusalem, which is a unique place to be as a prophet. And the prophecies assume the failure of Josiah's reforms. So remember, I said that King Josiah was the last king who wasn't a puppet king. And while King Josiah was in power, we can read this is 2 Kings chapter 22 to 23 and 2 Chronicles chapter 34 to 35. We read about how King Josiah had a temple renovation that was done. And while they were renovating the temple, they found the book of the law. And Chronicles and Kings tells a little different story. Chronicles has a better story than Kings does, but it's kind of goes along with one another. But Josiah saw this book of the law, read it, and said, we need to reform everything we're doing. Like, we are going down the total wrong path, which was true. And so Josiah got rid of destroyed idols. He reinstated the Passover celebrations, which hadn't been celebrated. and did a number of other reforms. And
Mhm.
but Jeremiah in this book doesn't talk much about Josiah's reforms, which is interesting. If Jeremiah started his public ministry right at the start of Josiah's reforms, you'd think he'd have something to say about it, because he has something to
Mhm.
say about everything else.
Mhm.
And this would have been the major thing that was happening. So
Mhm.
that's why many scholars think he may have been born at the time of Josiah's reforms and would have actually started his public speaking ministry after the reforms
that.
had failed,
Mhm.
which would have had him starting his public ministry closer to the time of the puppet kings.
Mhm.
And so the time of Jeremiah's life or ministry was over 4 periods of time. There was the reign of Josiah, the reign of Jehoiakim, which was installed by the Egyptian Pharaoh Necho. And that king was loyal to Egypt. And if you remember the story, he was loyal to Egypt, and then he saw Babylon was a little more powerful, so then he switched to Babylon, and so then he was loyal to Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon installed Zedekiah, and who became the next king. And then they betrayed Babylon and things fell apart. Jerusalem was attacked and Jerusalem fell. And so that's towards the end of Jeremiah's ministry, is he saw the aftermath of Jerusalem's fall, or at least his prophecy work speaks of that. The other thing that's interesting about Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, is that when you read it, you'll notice that it may read a little more confusing than some of the other books. Like it may seem like things are more out of order than in some other books. And Jeremiah is a book that has the greatest differences between the Greek Septuagint and the Hebrew text. So we have these two different texts, and in some books they're really close to each other, but in this place, the Greek Septuagint, which is what we are reading from in most of our Bibles, is shorter. It has a little bit of different content, and it has a different order of the chapters than the Hebrew text does, which points to that even when they were compiling the Bible, people did not agree on what order these chapters should be in. And also points to that there may have been different authors that wrote this. And so it may not have just been Jeremiah, but it may have been multiple authors that were put into the style of Jeremiah. Do you remember we talked about copyright had a very, wasn't really a thing and had a very different meaning. And so you would write in a style of somebody or the school of somebody, and that was an acceptable practice. It may also be that it was another person that's named in here is Baruch, and he is Jeremiah's scribe. So another theory is that these are scrolls of Jeremiah, and all the scrolls were collected over time, and his speeches were written down after the fact, and then collected and pulled together, and then compiled after Jeremiah was gone, which was probably likely done anyways, whichever way that you believe that. So that would account for some of the, did this really go here or not? I mean, if you think of your favorite speaker, most prolific writer that you've ever known, and then if you were to get all their writings, none of them are dated, and now you have to put them in some type of order and meaning that people read for centuries from now. It was quite a task that was before them to do that. Yeah, so you might notice that as you're reading it, don't try to read it with a really close eye to this must be in chronological order, because it's not always in chronological order. but it is still trying to convey something of importance to us. And in the Hebrew text shows us what of importance they're trying to convey. In the Hebrew text, the order of the books, the what we call the history in the prophets is put together as the prophets. And so you've got the Kings, the book of the Kings, the book of Chronicles. Those history books are telling what happened. And then the prophets are commenting on what happened. And so it's like the commentary on history. And you'll also notice that, especially through the prophets are telling the people again and again, you've tried this before and it doesn't work. Like, you've tried breaking the covenant with God and that didn't end well for you before, it's not going to end well for you again. And the repetitiveness of these prophets is also pointing that out throughout time. And so it's, the structure is almost a warning to us to not just continuously repeat the negative pieces of history that we like to repeat, which I think continues to speak to us through every time and every place often. To not just repeat history again and again. So that's kind of the context of Jeremiah and history, the context of Jeremiah within the Bible itself. Any questions there or comments?
Seems to me the prophets were never really popular. In fact, most of the time they were told more than once, get out of town.
Yeah.
Not too many of them were really tickled pink to be a messenger of God's meetings.
Yeah. Yeah. No one liked the prophets when the prophets were speaking. And the prophets did some weird things too. We've got, I mean, we read Isaiah and story of Isaiah walking around naked for a couple of years, just to, which, I mean, as we talked about, he was probably in an undercloak, most likely, but still seemed like to be walking around naked. And the prophets, the work of the prophet is to speak truth to what they're seeing in the world. And people don't always like to hear truth.
They still don't.
No, it's hard. It's hard for all of us to hear truth, especially when we realize that we're following down a path that's causing destruction to ourselves or to others. And that's, we always want to be the hero in our own story, and sometimes we're not. And that's okay as long as we can see that and move differently. But yeah, the prophets were not popular, and which is also why a lot of the writings of the prophets isn't compiled until after they're dead, because nobody wanted to listen to the prophets, and they were weird. And they were people that they kind of just pushed to the sidelines and said, you know, none of it's probably true. They're just, we don't want to listen to them. And so it's only after the prophecies, or which isn't a prophecy like a future telling, but like the speaking the truth to them, those things actually happened. The consequences that they were saying would happen that were seeable. Like if you pledge allegiance to a nation that has been destroying all other nations, you will probably also be destroyed. And that's what the prophets were telling them. But then when that became true, they wrote these down. And so hopefully future generations wouldn't fall down the same path. The other piece in Jeremiah is, you'll see when you get to chapters 4 through 10, is it talks about these enemies from the north that it'll begin to warn the people of. And it never tells us who these enemies are. It's just the enemies from the north. And And it depends what you believe about when Jeremiah's ministry began, as far as who these enemies from the north may have been. So if you think that Jeremiah's public ministry began around 627 and around the time of King Josiah, then those enemies would probably be the Scythians, who were nomadic people, big nation. And I've got a video I'll show you about it from the British Museum. And it was a nomadic nation, pretty powerful, interesting culture that came out of that. So that's if you think his ministry began during King Josiah's time. If you think that it began, that he was born around that 627, around King Josiah's, then the enemy from the north would be the Babylonians that he would be talking about. But let's pause and look at who the Scythians are. Are any of you aware of them?
No, I'd never heard of them.
So this is a short clip from the British Museum. There's, well, at least in 2017, they had an exhibit on them. I don't know if they still do right now. And so this is like publicity for their exhibit, but it was still pretty good. So.
Hello, I'm St. John Simpson. I'm the British Museum curator for the BP exhibition Scythians, Warriors of Ancient Siberia. The Scythians were a nomadic people, Iranian-speaking, who originated in southern Siberia in about the 9th century BC. They dominated the whole area from northern China to the northern Black Sea for centuries. The Scythians were warriors, horsemen, feared and respected by all of their neighbours. What you see in this exhibition are some of the really beautiful things that they were also capable of doing. The Scythians were master craftsmen, even if we don't know their names or even the genders of the people who made these objects in this exhibition. Some were very skilled at working gold, but there's also things carved from wood in miniature. There are textiles, there are felts, there are bronze objects made through casting. So there's a whole range of different media and techniques being used by different people across the steppe that the Scythians occupied. But what this exhibition shows is that nomads had a highly developed sense of style and art and a high level of craftsmanship to go with it. They enjoyed the good life and they knew how to make a good life. What we have the opportunity here to do is to show the alternative lifestyle of antiquity, and that is the world of the nomad. And what this exhibition specifically does is show the first great nomad power of the ancient world, the world of the Scythian nomads.
Yes.
Impressive.
Yeah.
Stop. There we go. So that's the Scythian nomads, and it's fascinating looking at nomadic peoples, because sometimes we think, well, they just traveled everywhere, so they were constantly hunting and they never had any downtime, which was not true at all. Actually, farming sometimes has a higher labor intensity and requires and takes away from free time, more so than like being a nomadic people did. And as you can see, they had a lot of artwork, a lot of craftsmanship that they did, and were a nomadic power of the ancient world. And so they would have been to the north and may have been, depending when Jeremiah began his ministry, may have been considered those enemies from the north, these people from far north that probably they didn't know a whole lot about, but had heard stories from, these people that spanned across a large geographic area, and had the ability to travel quickly, and travel with everything they had, and take over land and be able to do that. So may have been considered that, may have been, or could have been the Babylonians, which we've studied at other points too, and have talked more about, because the Babylonians come up quite frequently in the midst of these stories. So as you can see, what you believe about when Jeremiah began his ministry really determines what cultural context we're putting him within, as far as the larger spectrum of what's happening in the world. But either way, it's the story of the people towards the end of the time of Jerusalem, and the story of that fall, the struggles with that, and the struggles of what Jeremiah calls the unfaithfulness of the people, and considers them to be an adulterous nation, and uses that language quite often. So that takes us through. You'll see that enemy from the north discussed through about chapter 10. And then when you get even further on, you'll see the mention of Baruch and as the scribe. Jeremiah, it seems later in his ministry, got himself in enough trouble that he must have been barred from the temple. And so he had to send somebody else in to read his words because he wasn't allowed in anymore. And so that he'd write things, or the scribe would write it and then bring that in because it seemed he wasn't able to go in potentially. The other thing that we see in Jeremiah is there's pieces where Jeremiah plays back on those creation stories. Like Darlene, you mentioned just the importance of those creation stories to you. And in chapter 4, Jeremiah paints a parallel of the creation stories. Chapter 4, verse 23 is where that begins. I looked on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light. I looked on the mountains, and lo, they were quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and lo, there was no one at all, and all the birds of the air had fled. I looked, and lo, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins before the Lord, before God's fierce anger. So this parallels the layers of the creation story within it, and pulls that apart, and is almost but in the opposite, in saying that, look, the very things of creation are being unwound because of what you people are doing, and what we as a nation are doing. We are returning to a pre-creation time, is what Jeremiah is warning the people of, which is almost is worse, it seems, than just like you're in the midst of the fall. Like you didn't just get kicked out of creation, like you messed it up so much that like we're going back pre-creation because of you've messed it up so much. There's not even like the garden anymore. It's all been undone because of what you've done, is what Jeremiah warns the people of. And just powerful imagery, and to take these stories that the people would have known and would have heard since they were young children, and would have been able to tell by heart probably, just like we can tell the stories of the creation story quite well. We don't necessarily need to go to Genesis and read it. We've heard that story so many times. We can tell that story. And if you go back and imagine, well, we don't have TVs. We don't have like necessarily, not everybody can read, has books at easy access. We don't have phones. We don't have laptops. We don't have iPads. And we sit around and we tell stories for fun and do crafts that incorporate the stories. We make things that tell the stories to our children and to one another. And then to hear those words that you had heard poetically said so many times before, in the poetic form, in the reverse, would have been really powerful. And so that's what Jeremiah does within this, that we miss in English, and we miss just being in a different cultural context too. is that poetic piece of it, in the power that comes through that. Any pause there? Any thoughts?
If you're coming from a position of comfort, I can easily understand how those words would injure, would cause pain, dwell on them, think about them, to stop and rationalize, hey, this guy is making sense, or this guy's a nut. He's just look at the doom and gloom he's telling us. It would be so easy to just turn a deaf ear rather than sit and listen and contemplate.
Yeah. And the prophets didn't just speak to the common people, they were also speaking to the king. And so imagining too the power that the king had, and here's this guy off the street that acts weird and sending these scrolls in, and it's like getting spam mail every day just sent to you about how like you're doing everything wrong as a leader. And so in the pain of hearing that, and also the pain of wanting to, I don't know these kings personally, obviously, but I imagine like as that in some way they probably had some good intentions at heart too, that they probably did care about at least the nation that they were serving and ruling. And so that would also make it really difficult with conflicting advisors. Not everybody was telling them the same thing.
Yeah, I would think one common thought would be, who does this guy think he is? It's a wonder that they did. I know that many of the prophets did not come to a happy end at all, but people that were surrounding the kings, the advisors, it's surprising, I guess, to think they didn't at least take this point of view into consideration based on their history, because this is not foreign material and the possibilities are definitely there. And I guess I find it difficult to realize that people would rather deal with possible happy outcomes rather than contemplate the possibility that they may have to change in order to have a happy outcome. It's easier to just maintain status quo. And I guess the person I would feel the most sorry for would be like Baruch, the scribes. I know it's a Greek saying, but don't kill the messenger. You know?
Yeah. And the prophets saw themselves as messengers from God too. And not all of them wanted to share those words. In fact, most would, I think, rather have not.
Right.
Most of the call stories of the prophets begin with a reason why they don't think they should be a prophet.
Right.
Even Jeremiah's begins after that piece we shared in verse 4. The word of the Lord came before I formed you in the womb. I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Jeremiah said, Ah, Lord God, truly, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy.
Yep.
But the Lord said to me, do not say, I am only a boy. For you shall go to all to whom I send you, and you shall speak whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver them, says the Lord. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, now I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Which that in itself made prophets a threat to kings, to believe that they were appointed to throw down kingdoms, is a pretty bold thing to hold on to and to act out of. And the kings would have known that, like the prophets weren't around to keep the kings in power. The prophets were around to speak what the word of the Lord had given them and what they believed to be what they saw as the truth, not to keep the status quo by any means.
And I guess they really took a risk in fulfilling their obligations, because we learned from the story of Jonah what it means to defy an instruction.
Yeah. Yeah, there are varying degrees with which the prophets try to run away when called by God. And some of them go to far lengths to run away and have to be swallowed and spit out. Others are, I'm just a boy. All right, you win. And I guess I'll go with this. And so it depends on the person. But again and again in the stories that we have in the scripture, the call of God is so powerful that it overcomes those. No matter how far you run, it still follows. For where can we go and not find our God? So, and that's one of the things, that people say about their vocations, whatever vocation one might have, is that when you really feel called, then that call just keeps coming upon your life, and you keep trying to fall. Like, even if you try to do a million other things before, you will end up following that vocation because it keeps just trying to pull you to it. John is asking, did any of Judah's kings consult Jeremiah? So Jeremiah is in dialogue with the kings throughout this time. And so yes and no, to varying degrees. So Jeremiah is sending them words. Jeremiah at this point in who prophets are is that in this point in history, prophets are largely those who are speaking to people in power. If you remember the history of prophets early on, much earlier than this, prophets were more of considered people who spoke with the common person. But now at this period, prophets are more often speaking to people in power. And so yes, did they consider Jeremiah an advisor? To what extent they considered him advisor? That kind of depends on what Jeremiah was saying, and whether or not it fit in with what they were working on and what their goals were for that. But Jeremiah also spoke against them, especially against what were considered the puppet kings, against what was being done for that. And he doesn't speak a lot about Josiah's reign, or at least his reform programs. But prophets were consulted by kings too, and what we don't have in the Bible is the words of the prophets that the kings consulted with who were wrong. We don't have, so there were false prophets too, and there's stories of the false prophets, and like the main prophets who that we have stories of showing why the false prophets were false and were liars. And but when you're in the middle of that, I'm sure they weren't sure who were like false prophets and who were real prophets, and trying to figure that out. And so the kings probably did consult some prophets too, that later on were like, Babylon did attack us. You were really wrong. Like, this was really bad advice. You are not a true prophet. And would have been pushed to the side. And we do not have those writings in the Bible. And those would not have been kept throughout history either. You don't keep the necessarily tell the failures in your story. But a good question. Also, as you read through Jeremiah, you're going to notice that there's a lot of stories about Jeremiah. This is Jeremiah has the most stories about the prophet. And so as you're reading, I hope you find it to be an interesting one too. We hear about Jeremiah's family a little bit, stories about that. We hear a little bit about Jeremiah's visions and in different pieces that we don't necessarily get a view into in the other prophets. Now, how accurate is it and how much of it was added later? We don't know that because it was all compiled at a later time. But whoever compiled it was a good storyteller.
Yeah.
So that
was great.
That's an overview of Jeremiah. And so the sections we're going to go through at our next class through chapter 24 is what we're going to try to get through.
Okay.
Because that's kind of section 1. Jeremiah 1 through 24 is this first section, especially 1 through 20 is probably some of the oldest chapters for that very first section. And then chapter 25 is kind of a turning point that's going to be occurring. And then 26 through 51 are the next sections that we'll get into. 26 through 45 is a section, and then 46 to 51 could be considered another section in there.
Okay, so what are we doing for next week?
1 through 24.
1 through 24. Got it. I will read it.
Yep.
I hope you enjoy reading it. And for a summary of it, if you aren't able to read it, just reread chapter 1, verse 10, because that's kind of a summary of everything that Jeremiah is going to do.
Oh.
And that's one of the
1, verse 10.
chapter 1, verse 10. That's one of the ones that we just read, actually, is the see, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up and pull down. There's the summary of Jeremiah.
Yeah.
And that also kind of summarizes the structure of Jeremiah too, as you'll see as you're reading. It is structured in a way that Jeremiah is like talking to the nation. He's kind of like plucking them up and pulling them down and destroying and overthrowing all these things and all these like foes and woes that he has, and then starts to build and to plant for the structure too.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gretchen. This is great.
Yeah.
So enjoy, and we'll meet next week, and we'll do the online format for now. It's easier to do be all in one format than it is to be in 2 separate formats. And so, and especially with COVID numbers.
Yeah, they're really going up again.
So
yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Well, our prophet Fauci has been telling us that for a while.
This is true. So there's some things of history repeating itself here, and
Yeah. And we're not listening to him any more than people listen to Jeremiah.
I think, Camille, you've answered your own question about why people don't want to listen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. History repeats itself.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna
Okay.
say bye.
All right.
We'll see you next
Have
week.
a good night. Thanks for coming.
Yep.
Mhm.
Bye.
Thank you for leading.
Yes,
That was
certainly.
great.
Take care, John.